Well, welcome everyone to today's event, which is a bilingual poetry reading and discussion with two of the translators involved in a recently published collection of Isan's works. We have Jung and Sawako Nakayasu here with us. I'm Chris Hanscom. I teach modern Korean literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at UCLA. And I'm joined by one of our PhD students, Victoria Cottle, who organized the event, as well as Professor Hyun-Suk Park, who teaches classical Korean literature here at UCLA. Also, you just saw him briefly, but also with us is Hyung-Woo Kim, who is the Associate Director at the Center for Korean Studies. And this event wouldn't have been possible without his support and also without the generous sponsorship of the Center for Korean Studies here at UCLA. So thank you very much. I think I'll lead off by introducing our two guests, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask them some questions about their work following their readings. At that point, I'll turn it over to Professor Park, who will moderate the question and answer. I think you may receive instructions later, but I think that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It's a Zoom function, and you can type your questions in there, and then we'll receive the questions, and they'll be read out to the two panelists. But first, let me, before I go on with introducing our guests and in sort of kicking things off, let me invite Victoria to say a few words, if you're willing, just a bit about how you envision today's event or the series of translation-focused events that you're hoping to hold here.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanscom. Yes, so this is our inaugural event of the Kwajōng celebrating the process of translating Korean literature series, which was inspired really in part by this Isan selected works and several other incredible works of fiction that were coming out in 2020 that that enrich our field of Korean literature. And I wanted to really highlight the work and passion and scholarship that goes into bringing all of these texts into English and allowing our field to be opened to so many more people. And I'm really grateful to CKS for working with me to create these events and the ones that will hopefully be planned in the future. And thank you, Jack and Sawako, for agreeing to join us here today.
Right on. Thank you, Victoria. That's really fantastic. I think this is a great opportunity to think about even what translation is and to make the translation process more visible and to learn a little bit more about the time and the scale and the effort and the scholarship that goes into the final published version of a translation. And in essence, Victoria, as you were saying, to give the translators a platform to share their work with us and to get into how this works and how it might bear on our scholarship. I think it's a really excellent opportunity. So let me introduce our two guests and we'll get going. Jack Jung is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was a Truman Capote Fellow. He was born in Seoul, South Korea, and immigrated to the United States, where he received his BA in English from Harvard and an MA in Korean Language and Literature from Seoul National University. He is the American Literary Translation Association's 2021 Emerging Translator Mentorship Program mentor for Korean poetry, and currently teaches Korean poetry translation at the Literary Translation Institute of Korea. Sawako Nakayasu is an artist working with language, performance, and translation separately and in various combinations. She's lived mostly in the US and Japan, briefly in France and China, and translates from Japanese. Her books include Some Girls Walk Into the Country They Are From, Pink Waves, which is forthcoming, The Ants, and the translation of the collected poems of Chika Sagawa, as well as a book called Mouth Eats Color, Sagawa Chika Translations, Anti-Translations, and Originals, which I almost wish we were talking about today. It sounds so interesting. But that book is also forthcoming. It's a multilingual work of both original and translated poetry. She's co-editor with Eric Zeeland of an anthology of 20th century Japanese poetry, which is also forthcoming, and she teaches at Brown University. So welcome, Jack and Sawako. It's wonderful to have you here. So we talked about it in advance, and we think what might work best, given the sort of medium or interface that we're using, is to have the translators go one by one. Say a few words and read the poems that they've selected to share in both English and Korean or English and Japanese. So let's start with Jack, and we'll have the reading, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll move on to Sawako. We'll have the reading, and then we'll have a few questions for her. And then I may have a couple, 2 or 3 questions in general to ask both of you in my role as discussant after both of you are done your readings. And then we'll move on to the question and answer or the discussion section. So Jack, could I invite you to say a few words and read from your selection of Isan's poems? I think that you've chosen 4 for today, if I may be mistaken.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Hanscom, for that beautiful introduction. And again, many thanks to my friend Victoria for organizing this amazing event. I am really grateful for this chance to talk about Isang's work more in depth. And today I've chosen 4 of Isang's poems where the central motif in all of these poems are Isang's mirror. Isang's mirror is perhaps one of the subjects that's been written so much about in Korean literary studies since Isang made his debut. And 4 of these are basically the central poems that sort of talk about and show off his mirror image in various ways. And so what I'm going to do now is to share my screen with you, and we will look at the originals as they first appeared, and I will read the Korean first and then my English translations. 거울. 거울 속에는 소리가 없소. 저렇게까지 조용한 세상은 참 없을 것이오. 거울 속에도 내 귀가 있소. 내 말을 못 알아듣는 딱한 귀가 2개나 있소. 거울 속에 나는 왼손잡이요. 내 악수를 받을 줄 모르는, 악수를 모르는 왼손잡이요. 거울 때문에 나는 거울 속의 나를 만져보지를 못하는 고르마는, 거울 아니었던들 내가 어찌 거울 속의 나를 만나보기만이라도 했겠소. 나는 지금 거울을 안 가졌으면은 거울 속에는 늘 거울 속에 내가 있소. 잘은 모르지만 외로된 사업에 골몰할게요. 거울 속에 나는 참 나와는 반대요만은 또 꽤 닮았소. 나는 거울 속에 나를 근심하고 진찰할 수 없으니 퍽 섭섭하오. Mirror. Inside the mirror is soundless. Perhaps no other world is so silent. Inside the mirror, I still have ears. 2 pitiful ears cannot understand my words. Inside the mirror, I am a lefty who knows not how to take my handshake, a lefty who knows no handshakes. Because of the mirror, I cannot touch the me inside the mirror. Because of the mirror, I get to meet the me inside the mirror. I do not have the mirror now, but the me inside the mirror is in it. I do not know, but he is probably obsessed with his lefty work. The me inside the mirror is the opposite of me, and yet looks quite like me. I am disappointed. I cannot agonize on and examine the me inside the mirror. 오감도 시제 15호 1. 나는 거울 없는 실내에 있다. 거울 속에 나는 역시 외출 중이다. 나는 지금 거울 속에 나를 무서워하며 떨고 있다. 거울 속에 나는 어디 가서 나를 어떻게 하려는 음모를 하는 중일까? 2. 죄를 품고 식은 침상에서 잤다. 확실한 내 꿈에 나는 결석하였고 의족을 담은 군용장화가 내 꿈의 백지를 더럽혀 놓았다. 3. 나는 거울 속에 있는 실내로 몰래 들어간다. 나를 거울에서 해방하려고. 그러나 거울 속에 나는 침울한 얼굴로 동시에 꼭 들어온다. 거울 속에 나는 내게 미안한 뜻을 전한다. 내가 그 때문에 영어되어 있듯 그도 나 때문에 영어되어 떨고 있다. 4. 내가 결석한 나의 꿈, 내 위조가 등장하지 않는 내 거울, 무능이라도 좋은 나의 고독의 갈망자다. 나는 드디어 거울 속에 나에게 자살을 권유하기로 결심하였다. 나는 그에게 시야도 없는 들창을 가리키었다. 그 들창은 자살만을 위한 들창이다. 그러나 내가 자살하지 아니하면 그가 자살할 수 없음을 그는 내게 가르친다. 거울 속에 나는 불사조에 가깝다. 5. 내 왼편 가슴 심장의 위치를 방탄금속으로 엄폐하고 나는 거울 속에 내 왼편 가슴을 겨누어 권총을 발사하였다. 탄화는 그의 왼편 가슴을 통과하였으나 그의 심장은 바른 편에 있다. 6. 모형 심장에서 붉은 잉크가 엎질러졌다. 내가 지각한 내 꿈에서 나는 극형을 받았다. 내 꿈을 지배하는 자는 내가 아니다. 악수할 수조차 없는 두 사람을 봉쇄한 거대한 죄가 있다. Crow's Eye View, poem number 15. 1. I'm in a room with no mirror. Of course, the me inside the mirror has gone out right now. I shudder in fear of him. Where did he go? What is he plotting to do with me? 2. I sleep on a cold bed, damp from embracing my crime. I'm absent in my explicit dream, and the military boot carrying a prosthetic leg dirtied my dream's white page. 3. I sneak into a room with a mirror to free myself from the mirror. But the me inside the mirror always enters at the same time and puts on a gloomy face. He lets me know he is sorry. Just as I am locked up because of him, he is locked up shuddering because of me. 4. I am absent in my dream. In my mirror, my counterfeit does not make an entrance. He craves my loneliness despite my uselessness. I have finally made up my mind to recommend suicide to him. I point him toward the viewless window. It is a window for suicide. But he instructs me that if I do not kill myself, then he cannot kill himself either. The me inside the mirror is almost a phoenix. 5. After covering my breast above my heart with a bulletproof shield, I aim and shoot at my left breast in the mirror. The bullet goes straight through his left breast, but his heart is on the right side. 6. A red ink is spilled from an imitation heart. In my dream, I am late. I am sentenced to death. I am not the ruler of my dream. It is a great crime to seal up two humans who cannot even shake hands. 명경. 여기 한 페이지 거울이 있으니 잊은 계절에서는 얹은 머리가 폭포처럼 내려오고 울어도 젖지 않고 맞대고 웃어도 휘지 않고 장미처럼 착착 접힌 귀. 들여다보아도 들여다보아도 조용한 세상이 맑기만 하고 코로는 피로한 향기가 오지 않는다. 만적만적하는 대로 수심이 평행하는 불어 그러는 것 같은 거절. 우편으로 옮겨 앉은 심장일 망정 고동이 없으란 법 없으니 설마 그러랴 어디 족친 하고 손이 갈 때 지문이 지문을 가로막으며 선뜩하는 차단뿐이다. 5월이면 하루 한 번이고 10번이고 외출하고 싶어 하더니 나갔던 길에 안 돌아올 수도 있는 법. 거울이 책장 같으면 한 장 넘겨서 맞서던 계절을 만나련만. 여기 있는 한 페이지. 거울은 페이지의 그냥 표지. Clear mirror. Here is a mirror, one page of it. During a season now forgotten. My hair inside the mirror flowed down like a waterfall. My tears do not make the mirror wet, and the mirror does not bend. even if I laugh at its face. I see my ear tightly folded like a rose. I look in and keep looking in. The mirror's quiet world is pure. No tepid fragrance reaches my nose. Even after so many caresses, our hearts remain parallel, and it feels like a rejection. Of course, my reflection's heart is on the right, but it still must have a pulse. So why am I turned down? I reach with my fingers. A fingerprint blocks a fingerprint and cuts me off. During the month of May, I desired many times to be on the road. Had I gone, I may have never returned. If the mirror is like a page of a book, I will meet the season I once faced. But the page remains here, and the mirror is its bookmark. 면경. 철필 달린 펜축이 하나, 잉크병, 글자가 적혀 있는 지편, 모두가 한 사람치. 부근에는 아무도 없는 것 같다. 그리고 그것은 읽을 수 없는 학문인가 싶다. 남아있는 채취를 유리에 냉담한 것이 덕하지 아니하니 그 비장한 최후의 학자는 어떤 사람이었는지 조사할 길이 없다. 이 간단한 장치의 정물은 투탕카멘처럼 적적하고 기쁨을 보이지 않는다. 피만 있으면 최후의 혈구 하나가 죽지만 않았으면 생명은 어떻게라도 보존되어 있을 것이다. 피가 있을까? 혈흔을 본 사람이 있나? 그러나 그 난해한 문학의 끄트머리에 사인이 없다. 그 사람은 만일 그 사람이라는 사람이 그 사람이라는 사람이면 아마 돌아오리라. 죽지는 않았을까? 최후의 한 사람의 병사에 논공조차 행하지 않을 영예를 일신에 지고 지리하다. 그는 필시 돌아올 것인가? 그래서는 피로에 가늘어진 손가락을 놀려서는 저 정물을 운전할 것인가? 그러면서도 결코 기뻐하는 기색을 보이지는 아니하리라. 짓거리지도 않을 것이다. 문학이 되어버리는 잉크에 냉담하리라. 그러나 지금은 한없는 정밀이다. 기뻐하는 것을 거절하는 투박한 정물이다. 정물은 부득부득 피곤하리라. 유리는 창백하다. 정물은 백골까지도 노출한다. 시계는 좌향으로 움직이고 있다. 그것은 무엇을 계산하는 미터일까? 그러나 그 사람이라는 사람은 피곤하였을 것도 같다. 저 칼로리의 삭감. 모든 기구는 연한이다. 거진거진한 잔인한 정물이다. 그 강이 불구라는 시인은 왜 돌아오지 아니할까? 과연 전사였을까? 정물 가운데 정물이 정물 가운데 정물을 저면해이고 있다. 잔인하지 아니하냐. 초침을 포위하는 유리덩어리에 남긴 지문은 소생하지 아니하면 안 될 것이다. 그 비장한 학자의 주의를 환기하기 위하여. Looking glass. An iron nib pen dangling on a spindle, an ink bottle, and a letter. There is enough of each for one person. Nothing else. I am beginning to realize that it might be an unreadable text. His remaining body odor is tripped on the other side of the uncaring looking glass, making it impossible to investigate this tragic lost scholar. He is in the still life of pen and ink and letter, as lonesome as Tutankhamun's tomb. No signs of happiness. If we can have this scholar's blood, if his final blood cell still remains, then his life might be preserved. Do we have his blood? Have you seen his bloodstains? There is no signature at the end of his esoteric opus. If he is who he is supposed to be, then he will come back. Or he may actually be dead. He may have died being the final soldier, his honor undisputed with all the glory, tedious, Will he definitely return? Will he play tricks with his bony, fugitive fingers and move the still life of pen and ink and letter? Even if he does, he will never be joyful. He will not babble. He will remain cold toward his ink as he turns it into literature. But for now, he must be endlessly precise. The still life refuses pleasure. The still life must be tired. The glass is pale. The still life reveals even his bones. The clock's needles move leftward. What do their meters calculate? But the scholar, who is supposed to be himself, is probably weary. The calorie intake is reduced. Organs have expiration dates. Almost, it is a savage still life. Why won't this unbending poet return to us? Was he really killed in battle? There is a still life in the middle of a still life. The still life cuts away at a still life in the middle of a still life. Is this not cruel? The fingerprints on the mirror's glass lay siege to the clock's needles. They must be revived to air out the tragic scholar's warnings. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was 4 poems by Isan, read in both Korean and English. I have one extra slide to share regarding the last poem. I have always wondered if the poem that I've just read, The Looking Glass, which was published posthumously in 1939, whether Isang might have been considering this painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Marat, which is a famous painting about the revolutionary writer from the French Revolution. And some of the details I think you might notice is very similar to what was just read out loud in the poem. But it seems like a fitting image that Isang might have found inspiration in. So with that, I thank you again for this opportunity to talk about Isang's poems, and I look forward to more discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That was really, really wonderful. I'm always so envious of people who can read sort of elegantly and clearly, and that was certainly what we had with your reading. So thank you. I think it's my job to ask you some questions as the discussant, and I should say I don't really work on poetry at all, so I'm a bit nervous about addressing these questions to both a translator and somebody who's a working poet. In addition to this, it was difficult to read through the original poems themselves, which I did to prepare. And as you read through your translation of Looking Glass, I recognized a feeling in the second stanza. I am beginning to realize that it might be an unreadable text, was something that I felt as I was reading through the poems themselves. But ask questions I will. And my main point with all of the questions is to draw out how difficult and complex, at least to me, translating Isang must be, and to get, what's a good word? So to sort of engage with you on some of the decisions that you had to make in the process of translating. And one of the difficult things, it seems to me, is locating a subject in these poems. As you pointed out, these are the sort of mirror poems, right, that you've selected for us today. And the trope of the mirror announces more or less that there isn't going to be a simple one-to-one relationship between the speaker of the poem and the appearance of the self or the subject in the poem. In the poem called Mirror, for instance, and as the critic Lee Seung-hoon points out, we have the me inside the mirror, and the me outside the mirror, and these are opposite. They're deaf to one another, but they're also similar. So there's a visual dynamic here that we're all familiar with, which is the uncanniness of seeing yourself, your opposite self, appear in the mirror. But in Myeonggyong, in Clear Mirror, which is the poem I really have a question about here, there's also a temporal difference introduced, which the ijol, the season in the last stanza, points out, which is, I couldn't help noticing as I read through the poem with a magnifying glass, that ijol is, in its visual appearance, is sort of provocatively close to how Isang's name appears in Hanja. And so the ijol appearing in the mirror, that's just something I happen to notice. It's not in passing. But the conventional reading of the poem has the I of the poem in the present, and the appearance in the mirror, a woman, in a different time and possibly a different place. And I can see you've added the first person possessive pronoun my in the first stanza. My hair inside the mirror flowed down like a waterfall. In the second stanza, my tears, I see my ear, I look in to the mirror. And I wondered if you would say something about what your understanding of the poem is and how you're thinking about what are conventionally two figures, the looker and the looked at, male and female in the conventional reading of the poem. There are many ways of interpreting the poem, and I'm really interested in the meaning that you've accomplished in your translation and how it might be different from a conventional reading of the poem.
Of course. Thank you for such wonderful close reading of these translations and how they differ from the original in that sense, perhaps. I remember when I was when I was studying these works and reading Myeongkyung for the first time, my initial impression was that this was on a continuation of the relationship of the subject I and me inside the mirror, 나와 거울 속에 나, and that it was only after reading through some of the criticisms, such as the 이어령 that you pointed out in your email, that there was this conventional reading of thinking of it as two figures of male, female, and then when I read more into it, it seemed that there was a conventional reading of it because one of the aspects about this poem is that when it was first published, there was an illustration next to it. And that illustration was of a woman looking into the mirror. And of course, the poem itself was published on a magazine called 여성. And 여성 literally means women, and it was one of the few women's magazines, and it was one of the few magazines where a lot of Korean poets could get published, and a lot of Korean poets, when they got published on that platform, quote unquote, used feminine voice to write their poems. And recognizing all that, I still felt strongly that this was a continuation of a deepening of some certain type of relationship that Isan set up on his earlier mirror poems, in 거울 and in the mirror, and poem number 15 from Crow's Eye View. So for instance, I felt that the first mirror poem was literally the introduction of these two figures, and second one, poem number 15, was sort of an antagonistic relationship that deepens from feeling like they're trapped in this situation, dreamlike situation, perhaps allegorical of the real world. And then in Clear Mirror, the relationship becomes almost very intimate, physically intimate almost, denied of ultimate intimacy. It's erotic almost in a sense, all the touching and wanting to touch, which, so for me, by interpreting the subject as was in my way of sort of making a reading of this poem as that deepening of the relationship. And of course, Looking Glass for me was sort of, even though Isan died an untimely death, was sort of a conclusion of this relationship where the poet or the subject looking into the looking glass foresees their death and how their literature might be read as an unreadable esoteric work.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. And I'm certainly not suggesting that there is an authoritative reading of these poems.
Oh, no.
And comparing yours to that, as far as I could tell in reading them myself, there are at least 3 or 4 different possible meanings of any given
Of course, yeah.
In the poem. But I was just curious because that stood out to me as far as the motif of the mirror running through. I'll just ask one more question. I really, I have a lot of questions, but I think it would be inappropriate for me to ask them all and take up the time that maybe the audience would like to spend asking you and Sawako questions. So let me just ask one more, and it's about making the poems readable in our contemporary moment. In a way, we think of the 1930s when Isan was writing, it's fairly contemporary. The Korean language is not that much different than we encounter it as we encounter it today. But there are some points where, like for example, also in Clear Mirror, in the fourth stanza, where you have "I reach with my fingers," right, to the, which is a nice image. The attempt to touch the mirror, blocked by the mirror itself, right? You write a fingerprint blocks a fingerprint. The original term here in the poem is chokjin, which is a kind of palpitation. And it's a method of examining the human body and diagnosing illness through touch. It's very specific, it's a sort of a medical term. And this sense of a medical examination by palpitation might not be intelligible to the reader in the present. And so I wonder if, this is all by way of asking if you've made an effort to somehow make your translation more readable in the present moment, in this instance or any other, or whether that was not a consideration at all for you as you approach the original poems.
I think a lot of these sort of not anachronistic, that's not the right term. These sort of older technological cultural terms that Isan uses, I felt that in this case, there was a way for me to perhaps translate as like add in this medical examination as kind of its own entire image. But what I felt more compelling about Myeonggyong Clear Mirror for me was it's one of very few, if not perhaps the only one, where Isang writes in lines. And there's this beautiful music that's so different from his other work. And ultimately, my decision to sort of shorten the medical style of palpitation to reaching with fingers was more of a musical choice, form choice that tried to make the reading of this poem in English as sonically pleasing as possible, or at least what I heard in the Korean. Of course, there are other cases. I think, for example, there were other cases where I was just trying to research a lot of his Hanja usage, which he has a tendency to flip the order, the common order of the Hanja, just because sometimes, or perhaps that's part of his mirror image that he's trying to do. And Sawako will probably touch upon this, but the way he uses hiragana and katakana for hiragana words, that's another thing that he just plays around with and is at first seems like kind of this excess in language that turns sharply political at times. I remember one of my SNU colleagues once told me, well, one of the experience of reading Isang is the sheer difficulty of the terms, the Hanja that he uses. So they're kind of a half-hearted but perhaps half-serious recommendation. Why don't you translate all these Hanja into Latin? And then that difficulty might come across to Western readers. And I think for a translator who's working across a century or a few centuries of time, there is a tendency and perhaps desire to bring it closer to our language. And I think that's what my choice often was based on.
Yep, that's wonderful. Thank you. Let me, I'll save my, I see we have questions popping up in the Q&A, and I don't want to take any more time here. So I'll save my questions that remain for the end if there's any chance to deliver them. But for now, let's turn to Sawako, and I wonder if you'd be willing to say a few words and then read the two poems that you presented for us today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Thanks to Professor Hanscom and Victoria and Jack and everyone whose labor may not have been visible to me. I'm happy to join you here, and thanks for all the work you did to make this possible. I am happy to share a couple of poems that I translated of Isan, and I'm going to share my screen with you to do this. I'll say that I first was introduced to Isan's work when I was living in Japan. This was the early 2000s, and Kyunmi Park, who's a Korean Japanese poet, she had asked me to translate the first poem from the Crow's Eye View series, which is one of his most famous poems. It got translated and put on a poster for this avant-garde art school that she and her husband were involved with, called the Yotsuya Art Studio. So that was my first introduction, was just being asked to translate something. And in that process, I came to learn what an interesting poet he was. And the thing that really struck me was that I had already been translating the poems of modernist avant-garde Japanese poets who were working at the same time, so his contemporaries. And because I was already familiar with the kinds of experimentation that was going on in that group of poems or poets, when I read Isang's poetry, I just felt from his work that he must have read these works, because both Isang and these Japanese poets were doing such interesting things with language within their poems that I had never seen anywhere else in Japanese poetry, especially, and then all the more so in Isang's work. It was even kind of an extension of that experimentation. So I just want to show you a couple things. For example, this is the poet Shika Sagawa, who I translate. And one feature of the modernist poetry was how they would incorporate vocabulary that was from newly imported Western language contexts and cultures. So this poem uses the word promenade from French and the word screen. Both of these are sort of new to the Japanese lexicon in general, but they're throwing it into their poems. There's a very disjunctive feel to it. And then on the other hand, some other poets, this is Hagiwara Kyojiro, and he was doing a lot of work with graphic design. This one is translated by William Gardner, but that kind of play with typography and graphics was one of the features, and sort of one of many features that were part of that modernist poetry in general. So this is a poem of Isang's that we reproduced in the recent Wave books. And you see how, when I saw this, I thought there's something very connected in the work that he's doing. And this is one of the original pages. Thanks to Jack, by the way, for doing all of this research and footwork and finding the original publications, the first publications. They're very hard to find, I imagine. And it's really a pleasure to see them. So I'm going to read a poem called Fragment Scenery, which starts in this lower left-hand corner. I sort of pieced together the poem so you can see it, but it's a little bit hard to read all the characters. So I also made a version from a newer edition. So I'll read it in Japanese first. 破片の景色。三角は俺のアモローズである。俺は仕方なく泣いた。伝統がタバコをふかした。三角は W の愛である。三角よ、俺は苦しい。俺は遊ぶ。俺のスリッパーは歌詞と同じでない。 いかがに俺は泣けばよいのか。寂しい野原を思い、寂しい雪の日を思い、俺の皮膚を思わない。記憶に対して俺は合体である。本当に。一緒に歌いなさいませ。と言って俺の膝を叩いたはずのことに対して三角は俺の夢である。ステッキ。君は寂しく有名である。どうしよう。地区に三角を埋葬した設計であった。Here's the English. I'm going to read it out of the book, actually. Fragment Scenery is my amoureuse. I gave up and cried. The lamppost puffed a cigarette. Is I over W. Oh, I suffer. I play. Slippers are not the same as candy. In just what way am I expected to cry? Thinking about those lonely fields, thinking about that lonely day of snow. I am not thinking about my skin. I am a rigid body against memory. Is my dream, as opposed to the fact that you should have hit my knee saying, perhaps you might sing together. Really. A cane, you are lonely and famous. What do I do? At last, I buried. It was a snowy landscape. Oh, did I not show you? Okay. Here is the next poem called Hunger. In the original printing, and here's a newer printing in case anyone wants to follow along. Kūfuku. 右手に菓子袋がないと言って左手に握られてある菓子袋を探しに今来た道をゴリも逆戻りした。この手は化石した。この手はもう何者も所有したくもない、所有せるものの所有せることを感じることをもしない。今落ちつつあるものが雪だとすれば、今落ちた俺の涙は雪であるべきだ。俺の内面と外面と、このことの系統であるあらゆる仲間らは恐ろしく寒い。左、右、この両側の寺がお互いの義理を忘れて、再びと握手することはなく、困難な労働ばかりが横たわっている。この片付けていかねばならない道において、独立を固執するのであるではあるが、寒く洗う、寒く洗う。誰は俺の指して孤独であるというか、この群雄割拠を見よ、この戦争を見よ。俺は彼らの圧力の発熱の真ん中で昏睡する退屈な歳月が流れて、俺は目を開いてみれば、死体も蒸発した後の静かな月夜を 俺は想像する。無邪気な村落の飼い犬らよ。吠えるなよ。俺の体温は適当であるし、俺の希望は甘美くある。美しくある。That one's hard to read. Okay, hunger. No snack bag in my right hand, I said, and backtracked 5 ri on the path I just came in search of the snack bag clutched by my left hand. This hand has fossiled. This hand no longer wants ownership of anything, will no longer even feel the ownership of that which is owned. If the thing in the process of falling right now is snow, then my tears that just fell should be snow. My interior and exterior and each and every midpoint regarding this system is frighteningly cold. Left, right, these hands on either side forget their obligation to each other and never again shake hands. And upon this road that needs cleaning, that is full of difficult labor, sprawled about, I persist in independence, but it must have cold. It must have cold. Who points at me and calls me lonely? Just look at this rivalry of warlords. Just look at this war. I fall into a stupor in the middle of the fever attack of their discord. Tedious months and years flow by, and I open my eyes to see. I imagine a quiet moonlit night after the corpses have evaporated. Oh, innocent dogs of the hamlet, don't you bark. My body temperature is irresponsible, and my hopes are sweet indeed. Thank you.
That's so wonderful. Thank you, Sawako, for that reading and also for the introduction. It's extremely interesting. As you were reading Hunger, it occurred to me that we can really see continuity with the poems that Jack selected in the sort of division between the right hand and the left hand, sort of mirroring the split self that appears inside and outside the mirror. I think that you read the hands forget their obligation to each other. They do not shake hands, right? Just as the right-handed me outside the mirror couldn't shake hands with the lefty in the mirror. There's also the reappearance of coldness in that poem, cold of a kind of non-relation or of independence from the other. And there may be something to say about this later, but let me just ask, I can see I've been looking at the questions in the Q&A and they're so much better than my questions that I just want to get to them. But let me just ask maybe one or two, just sort of very quickly, things that occurred to me as I was looking at your translations. And one of the things is, and you sort of mentioned it when you talked about the avant-garde and modernist work that you were looking at before you began your reading. But one striking thing about these two poems is how they appear on the page. And the layout, the white space, the use of symbols. I noticed that you held up the inverted triangle or the sort of upside down triangle. I don't know why that's upside down, but that triangle.
Well, there are two. There's one way and the other way.
That's right. And I suppose either one could be read as an inverted triangle. But there seems to be this attempt to achieve meaning formally, as well as in terms of the content of the writing. And I wondered if you could say more about the visuality of these poems, and if you took that into consideration when you were thinking about how to render them on the page in translation.
Yeah, the poems are very visual, and the most striking aspect of their visuality for me as a Japanese reader is in the extreme subversion of orthography that he uses. And even in reading these poems to you today, I could feel my stumbling because of partly because of his grammar and syntax, and partly because of the inverted orthography, where he's switching the characters you use for local Japanese language versus foreign language. And by switching that, it creates a very interesting disorientation of the basic language. So as I'm reading something in Japanese, I feel the poem signaling to me that it's not written in Japanese, even as it is. And so that's a hard thing to translate. It's hard to bring that disorientation. And one of the reasons why I use a lot of capital letters and small caps is partly because the blockiness of those characters speaks to the blockiness of the katakana characters that are phonetic. But there's also just a way in which the reading experience is intentionally stilted, or there's an awkwardness in the syntax. And so whatever I was doing was trying to replicate that awkwardness, which is a little bit different from other kinds of translation that I've engaged in, where I'm trying so hard to make it beautiful and to make it good, which I didn't think would serve these poems very well, because they were so intentional and there was so much clarity in some internal logic that the poems held. I can't claim that I understand the internal logic fully. It's very complicated, but my job as the translator is trying to engage what I can see at the surface of the language, and to create a somewhat similar experience in the English.
Yeah, that's incredible, and very revealing. I hadn't realized what you were doing with the katakana and hiragana and the capitalization until just now, but that's extremely interesting and a nice approach to translating a difficult material. I wonder if you would mind if I turn to a couple of questions that could be addressed to both of you. And this is a little bit away from a close reading of the poems and more toward the process of translation and working together. It's just incredibly interesting to be able to hear from you as translators in terms of the work that went into producing this volume. So I guess I would ask if you could each say a little bit about what the collective translation and editing process was like, particularly in terms of working to bring a kind of cohesiveness to the volume across multiple languages. What was it like, this sort of collective process? I think there were at least 4 translators at work, editors and.
Shall I, Sawako, start?
Sure. I mean, I was just going to say it was really challenging, but I think you can take it, Jack.
So I had been working on or studying Isan since college and well into my graduate program at Seoul National University, and I'd say there wasn't a role that everyone was given or anything, but I was the guy who did the research on the facsimiles and the original pages and finding them, scanning them, going back to Korea, and then so doing sort of the legwork on that helped us have this foundation from which we could all work together. And of course, Danmi was the sort of the conductor of this orchestra in a sense, because had it not been for her, my early drafts of these translations were something that I'd been working on for many years, but hadn't been considered for publication anywhere until Danmi approached me about creating this Isan volume that was both a there would be a first major introduction of Isan into English, and as well as this artifact in which translators are engaging through essays and personal experiences and timelines what Isan means as a literary figure, historical figure, and as a poet that we've come to admire and find difficult and love.
I want to mention too, you were talking earlier about the poems and the question of how to bring something to a contemporary audience. And one of the things that I find very beautiful about Donmi's conception of the book as a whole is that her vision for editing and the kinds of work that got combined into one book is a way of bringing it to the contemporary moment and bringing it in conversation with her own work as a writer, translator, and Korean American human, and also with Joelle McSweeney's work that Donmi had done a lot of work with Joelle before. And so there's a way in which the contemporary aspect of bringing the translation forward is in the editing rather than necessarily at the language level. So I feel like it's a process that really bridged time for us in an interesting way.
Yeah, that's tremendous. Let me just ask this. I'll just ask one more, and then I'll pass it on to Professor Park for the Q&A. But it's just something I'm very curious about, and I can't help myself from asking. I know you're both poets in your own right, and I wonder how your own work as poets has had an impact on your work as translators of poetry, if any, if any.
Well, I guess I'll go first. I've been translating Japanese poetry for a little over 20 years now, and I've often been asked that question, and I've often wondered what the answer was, because it's not necessarily something that I can identify in the language of my poems themselves. I don't think it's necessarily visible at that level. And yet, all the work that I've done with the modernists, with Isan, with these very, very experimental, individual, iconoclastic people, they have affected, if anything, it's more about my stance as an artist and what I care about, what I value, how I perceive my role in the world as an artist, and and um, and those things they're large. They're not necessarily things that I think about very actively, but I feel that I'm in kind of a conversation over all this time with the kinds of things they were doing.
I so I my poetry writing began at the same time as my translation passion sort of got ignited, and uh, I've often been sort of thinking of those as one and the same in a sense, because a very initial introduction was, well, if you know another language, my one of my college workshop professor recommended that if you know another language, you should definitely translate, and that would be a great way for you to learn the craft. And that's how it began. But the more I did it, it became perhaps as important, or if not more important, in because this work of bridging the cultures for readers who are not able to sort of jump across as some of the translators can, felt a very meaningful work that was almost like a public service in a sense. Whereas I guess my own poetry, it remains very private even now, and I assume it must have been for Isan, who was fascinating because he was adamant about publishing these poems and works on the most public spaces possible, on the newspaper and things like that. And Sawako just said he's an iconoclast, and indeed he is. He was very much about updating the language to be able to face the cruel illusions of his time, I think. And I think that sort of has been a guiding star for me in my writing, to be able to fight off anything that's holding us back from a true experiences.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for those answers. Let me just pass it off to Professor Hyun-Suk Park, who I think will take it from here and sort of moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, and thank you for Professor Hanscom for the discussion. My name is Hyun-Suk Park, and I'm here to be moderating the Q&A session. So if you have any questions to the presenters, please post your questions at the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, so that I can convey them to the presenters. We have a couple of questions already, so I'm going to read them in order. So the first question is from Guimarães, Carolina. Besides from the semantic implications of the mirror, Isan also uses mirroring in the very form of the text. Could you tell us a bit of how you see it in Isan's work and how it is like to translate it? And the second one is not a question, but a comment from Min-Sung Kim, a PhD student at UCLA. It's interesting to note that the book cover of a novel entitled "I Have My Right to Destroy Myself" by Kim Young-ha also has the same painting by Jack Louis Davis, The Death of Mara, as a cover photo. In some ways, Kim and Isan could meet across different times and places regarding how self-division occurs. So I think the first question was to Jack Jung. Could you please answer in any way?
Of course. So the semantic implications of the mirror or the mirroring in the very form of the text, I believe Carolina is talking about some of the other poems that were not mentioned today, including poem number 4 from Isan's Crow's Eye View. If you can see it here, we see in this work, Isan uses a mirror image of the numbers, this number board, which he actually made this number board in his earlier Japanese work first, and Sawako has translated it. It's a poem called Diagnosis 01. Let me see if I can find that here. Here is, yep. And in this one, the numbers are presented correctly. They're not mirror images. And I've always wondered, I've always found it fascinating what the implications and possible interpretations of that are, to have one language's version be on the right side, and then his native language, his mother language's version to be on the left side, so to speak. And Isan is constantly using these formal visual experimental forms, as well as using these mirror motifs throughout his other works in essays and short stories. One of his early works called 지도의 암실, Dark Room of the Map, is a short story that's very experimental. It's difficult to read, but throughout it all, there's a constant appearance of someone inside the mirror that's always chastising, or that seems to be working against the protagonist. So I think for me, it's important to see these mirrors as a continued exploration that Isan, as the writer and poet, was exploring. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Professor Lothar von Falkenhausen, a specialist of early China teaching here at UCLA. He asked, And the first slide he's asking to Jack. In the first slide, I noticed that, quote unquote, die Chinesische Kunst, meaning Chinese art in Germany, is written in mirror writing about the poem. Is there an intended referentiality to the topic of the poem? Why the German? Does a weird Art Deco typeface convey an additional layer of meaning?
So I believe Professor Falkenhausen is talking about this specific image. And I remember when I first saw this, I had a similar desire to explore what this Art Deco design was doing. And then when you go to the actual magazine it was published in, this design is on all the pages from start to finish. And this right to left type, I thought initially that it was a specific mirror type image, but then this was being done throughout the entire magazine as well, as if like it's kind of border on the upper side. So the magazine itself was called Catholic Youth. It was published by the Myeongdong Sangdang, the Myeongdong Cathedral, and one of the few Korean language magazines that were glossy magazines, as well as a general interest magazine that could publish a lot more Korean language works freely at the time during the Japanese occupation. So I have tried, I went through the other works in this issue to see what the Chinese art was exactly talking about, but I couldn't find the very definite connection to any of this. But it is something I would love to sort of go back to when I get a chance. So thank you for pointing that out. This used to be one of my obsessions back in the day.
Yes, Professor Falkenhausen left a message that he has to leave for class, but I hope he can be taking a look at the recorded video later on. I guess the next two questions can be addressed to both of you. So the first one is by Kayri. Are there a particular set of rhyming choices, practices, rules that you make in relation to translating into the Korean language, especially because English is such a rhyme-based language and Korean isn't? And the next one is by Kyung Park. Is it possible to accurately get the nuances in meaning across from Asian languages such as Korean and Japanese into a Western language like English? So I guess either of you can share your ideas.
I can start by saying that I personally haven't noticed a lot of rhyme in Isan's poems, but there is a lot of rhythm and a lot of music, and it does take a certain kind of listening to his sound patterns, which can be replicated in English to some degree. So it's, for me, I don't think it's so much about the rhyming, but there is still a lot of sound that comes across.
It's fascinating in the case of Isang's use of musicality in his language, because as Sawako just mentioned, even in Korean, he has a very aggressive and definite sense of rhythm. It's very in your face about the most immediate effect is how he uses repetition throughout throughout his works that almost feel like chanting. And another aspect of it, though, is Isang in one of the magazines back in the day was asked a question in a very short interview that asked a bunch of poets at the time, what is your favorite line in Korean poetry right now? And Isang answered, and I'll try to say it as poetically as possible. I love this line from Jung's poem, and Jung was one of his mentors, and Isan said, 검정콩 푸른콩을 주마. And that, the musicality of that line, I hope even if you don't speak Korean, you can hear it, 검정콩 푸른콩을 주마, is so different from rest of Isang's works. Like, he doesn't try to imitate anything like that. He is doing something very different in his own style. And some have argued that what Isang did in this near prose-like style is what has come to sort of dominate Korean poetry in general since then. And so in case of English, however, I would also argue that English is very difficult language to rhyme, and that's why some of the rhymes stand out more when poets go out of their way to make their rhymes. I mean, like, compared to Italian, English is like hell. It's very difficult to rhyme. So, and those kind of things, I think, are less about rhyming and more about finding a sense of a rhythm in both Korean and how to make that happen again in English.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess we have another question on the musicality of poems from Seth Chandler. Hearing the poems read in Japanese made me wonder about the sound conventions of Japanese poetry. I don't speak Japanese, but it seemed like there were so many repeated sounds at the beginnings and sometimes ends of lines and phrases. Is that in keeping with some tradition, a break from tradition, intentional, coincidental, or am I imagining it?
No, you're not imagining the repetition. Often they do happen at the beginnings of lines, sometimes at the ends. Those are very, very present. But as far as the other part of your question about relationship to tradition, it's really a huge break. And Isan is not a Japanese poet in the first place, so he's already working from the position of being a colonized subject and writing in a colonial language in the midst of the occupation. And so he's very aware that he does not inhabit the language in the same way that a Japanese person would. But the thing that's interesting about that is that he doesn't take that as a problem per se. He kind of embraces his position, and even in terms of error, he'll do things that are grammatically incorrect in Japanese. And I can only guess, but I have a feeling that he's being intentional in breaking not only from poetic traditions, but also breaking from grammatical conventions where they're just very awkward. Like, there's one line, kasekishita, that's translated into he is fossiled. And in our minds, we're likely to want to say something got fossilized. Nothing can ever get fossiled. It doesn't work. And yet he's insisting on these kind of these subverted grammatical elements. And so it's just something, it's a break, but it's such a far break because he was imitating and learning from poets who themselves were making a huge break from traditional poetry. So it's hard to communicate the degree to which his poems are so unique in the context of Japanese poetry, especially. They're just unlike anything else that I've read or translated.
I would just like to add that if you are interested in reading more about Japanese avant-garde movement, this is a great book, Shredding the Tapestry of Meaning. It's about one of the Isan's sort of contemporaries, Kitasono Katue's poetics. I highly recommend this as a kind of an introduction to what sort of a general avant-garde movement was like in Japan and how it may be, perhaps we could argue one day some kind of sort of a pan East Asian thing was going on. We'll see.
All right, thank you so much. We have another question from Seth Chandler. I'm also curious about the place of Isan's writing in Japanese literature. You mentioned that he was probably reading the Japanese avant-garde poets. Were they reading him? Do people commonly read him now?
It's hard for me to know very definitively, but I doubt they were reading his work at that moment. I don't think he was publishing in Japan. He was publishing in occupied Korea. And I haven't seen any evidence that they had read his work. On the other hand, there are people who read him now because there are people who have come to recognize this, this fascinating poet. So I own a big anthology of Isang's work translated into Japanese, and in that book, there's a section of it that contains the works already that were written in Japanese. So it's accessible and available. It's probably not read by that many people. It's not a mainstream part of the canon, but it is part of that modernist history. So there are some people who know about it and who read it.
All right, thank you. We have one more question from Guimaris, Carolina. How do the characteristics of Isang's poem differ from his Korean works and his Japanese works?
I guess I should start by saying that Isang's first major Korean publication was in the newspaper where he published the series Crow's Eye View, 15 poems, of which some of which are, we could say, is his translation that he does of his own Japanese works into Korean, the one that I showed you before with the number board. And so some of his most experimental, visually striking poems are in Japanese, whereas his more Korean poems tends to be these kind of prose blocks that are exploring many of his motifs that constantly repeat themselves: knives, mirror, women, flower, and this multiple selves converging into one personality. These things, I think he seems to have been exploring what was possible in a prose form before his untimely death. So I can't say exactly how he would have gone on writing, but there is this intense break between visual experimentation to writing more in prose. Somewhat more conventional prose, because it's not really conventional prose, but it looks like prose.
Sawako, do you want to provide any answers?
Well, I would agree that perhaps his earlier works in Japanese were more linguistically experimental, and there's a part of me that wonders if he was wanting to reach a wider audience when he realized that people were a little bit, they were not so friendly about his experimentations. It was so shocking and radical in his context that, I wondered if he wanted to to connect to a wider audience, and not necessarily that as the only reason, but that his work seems to have evolved a bit over time. And it's too bad that there isn't more of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, all right, thank you. This is a kind of request from Maribel Molina. I'd like to know if you have a book recommendation for the Korean avant-garde movement.
Oh, I would say actually sort of introduction to this period would be Professor Hanscom's Real Modern would be a great introduction. Another work, I can't think of right off the top of my head, but in English, I would highly recommend Professor Hanscom's work, and sort of get a feel for what kind of very challenging, difficult modernist writings were being done by Isan and his contemporaries and his circle, his 구인회, the circle of nine writers who were also sort of challenging the conventions of the time with their own writing. Of course, besides the circle of nine, there was KAF, Korea Artist Proletariat Federation, which was a socialist writing group in Korea, and then they were led by figures like Im Hwa, who you may be able to find some translations online on the Margins website through Asian American Writers Workshop, and that those kind of figures were like Isang was one of many Korean writers that were working at the time, and I would hope that study into this from American universities would expand more, certainly, and then that we can sort of talk about this in as a part of a world literature, so to speak.
Okay.
Also, I just want to add, there's another anthology on global modernisms that came out recently. One of the editors is Alice Moody, and that features Isang in the Korea section. And it's interesting as a book because it places him and his contemporaries in the context of the global modernist poetry and writing. So that would be a place to go to.
Well, thank you so much. Well, we were going to end the event by at 2:30, so I guess we can accept still one or two more questions. So if you have any questions, please post them on the Q&A. While waiting for them, I guess I can ask a very broad questions to both of you. I can imagine that it must have been a very painstaking work to translate Isang's poems. So I was just wondering how your work changed your understandings of his poems in any ways.
That is a broad question, but if I may, I guess for me, it was a process of learning about another human person in a much more intimate way than I imagined. And I say that because Isang, at least from a Korean student perspective, is this almost mythical figure, part of the constellation in Korean literature, difficult and distant and overwhelming at times. But I think the more I learned about him by closely reading his work, it became obvious to me that he was someone who struggled and found ways to express and find freedom in writing in what was unimaginably difficult time to be a Korean person in the 20th century.
I would say that at the time that I discovered Isang's work was the time that I was living in Japan, and I was living in Japan for the first time in my adult life. I had been born there, but I lived most of my life in the US. And having gone to schools in the US for all of my education, I actually had very little understanding of the history between Japan and Korea. So my learning about Isang coincided with my learning about the sort of horrific history between these countries. And so in that context, I think that when I first read Isang, it was interesting experimental avant-garde poetry. But as I spent more time with it, I do find myself thinking about what that experience is to be both experimental and writing in the midst of colonialism, and to be sort of you know, like one interpretation I have of this is that he's appropriating these tools of the avant-garde to subvert the Japanese language as a kind of linguistic rebellion that he is free to do, in part because those poems were so mysterious and hard to interpret very accurately. There's no clear reading you can make out of some of these poems, even though there are references that are military, that refer to war, they're violent and aggressive, and there's definitely a struggle in these poems. And I think that it's interesting to consider how these Japanese poems in particular are that wrangling with the situation at the level of language, at the level of his poetics. And you know how interesting it would have been if he could have taken a moment to write a poetic statement or a manifesto or something that articulated what he was doing and why and how these pieces connect, because we can only look back and guess. But I find it very compelling, even as it remains mysterious to me in a lot of ways.
Well, thank you so much. We have a message from Lisa HK. Thank you so much, Jack and Sawako, for these amazing translations. And I'd like to say the same thing. Thank you so much for these great translations. Personally, I have never imagined that we will be able to have any, translations of Isan's poems in English, and I'm sure that many students and scholars and readers will be benefited from your works in the future. I'd like to announce to the audience that the translation, Isan Selected Works, is now available. It was published last year in 2020. Okay, so please buy the book. All right, thank you so much. I guess
it's massive. It's a really thick.
Yeah.
There's a lot of poetry in it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining this event. Well, this webinar series, Kwajong, celebrating the process of translating Korean literature, will be ongoing throughout the year. So please stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.